So everyone knows that a ketogenic diet focuses on keeping your carbs low and your fat high. But what about protein? Well, we're going to take a look at how protein can affect a ketogenic diet today.
So as you might know, a ketogenic diet depends mainly on keeping your carbohydrates low enough to generate ketones, that alternate fuel. So we lower carbohydrates, that lowers our blood glucose and blood insulin levels. That opens the door for fat to be utilized, and then we get the production of ketones.
So we typically increase our fat intake as we restrict our carbs, and that's for a couple of reasons. Number one, we have to balance our caloric intake. We talked about you can't do low fat and low carb at the same time. You need those that caloric balance in there. It also, the fats help support the ketogenic machinery that's going on, producing the ketones, pulling that body fat out. That also provides some satiety and flavor factors, to our diet.
Yeah, so there's good reasons when you get rid of the carbs to increase the fat. So what happens to that stepchild in the middle who's protein, right?
Right.
So we've always been told that we keep protein intake at a moderate but adequate level to maintain our lean tissue, because if we go too high, we can interfere with fat burning and ketosis. So what is the reasoning behind that?
Right. So the theory has always been that an excess protein intake is going to cause gluconeogenesis. Protein can't be stored in any real way, in the way it is, the way you intake it. So gluconeogenesis happens when the liver takes something that is not a carbohydrate and turns it into a carbohydrate, basically, or glucose. And then it's released into the bloodstream, blood glucose. That's going to raise insulin, and that is going to shut down ketosis and that fat burning machinery that you've got going on.
Yeah. So if you've looked into a low carb or a ketogenic diet before, you might have been able to follow him. Like, that's kind of like the theory. You might have been able to. I followed it, honey. That's
Sciencey.
That is the theory of why we keep our protein moderate. But is this backed up by the research? Well, we have one research study that we can show to you. It has a nice graph with it. There, our lovely assistant Keith is showing you. This was actually looking at hunger hormones, but they also looked at what happens to your insulin levels when you take in carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And we see from the graph that carbohydrates have the most peak in insulin, protein has about half of that peak, and then fat has much less of an effect on insulin.
Right. The interesting part, I think, about that study, and you look at that graph, the insulin levels actually stayed elevated. Now, they came down from their peak, but they stayed elevated for the entire 6 hours that they were taking those measurements. Carbohydrate came down below normal. Fats didn't have really any effect.
Yeah.
But that insulin level remained elevated, which means that you're not going to be making any ketones. That protein really affected, ketone production, the way being elevated.
I thought that was interesting too. So in other words, after a high protein meal, you're having an elevated insulin level 4 hours afterwards.
Right.
Yeah, I that's not something that we hear about often.
No.
And you have an anecdotal story can back up what we just talked about.
I have a story. So anecdotally, so I've been trying kind of some new protocols and looking at keeping myself in ketosis. So I've been doing a ketogenic diet. When I say that, I mean I'm doing a diet that gives me measurable ketones. It's not just low carb. I mean, I'm not saying it's a keto diet, I'm not measuring, okay? And if you know me, if you watch the channel for any length of time, you know that being in ketosis first thing in the morning, very difficult for me, just historically.
Yeah.
Just really hard to make it happen.
There is no doubt that Keith and I have different metabolisms that affect the way our bodies lose weight.
So I was at 0.6 ketones, which I was super happy about, being in ketosis first thing in the morning.
Which is not easy for you.
Right. So I'm rarely in ketosis first thing in the morning. That a lot of times my blood glucose is kind of on the high level, a lot of times in the 90s, and even been over 100 at a certain point. And a lot of times along with that, my ketones have been low.
So the new protocols I've been doing have been helping that. The first week of this, which was last week, I was able to wake up and be at 0.6 ketones every morning, and in the mid-80s blood glucose. Well, so Friday night we went out to a restaurant, and we ended up splitting an order of wings that were actually, I don't like wings, I like drummies, so pay a little extra for it, but they're loaded with meat, and I like that.
They were, and they're not breaded.
That's right. They were dry rub.
Dry rub.
Yep. Chili powder and something.
Yeah. And lime. That was really good.
Yeah. But a lot of meat on those, and then we had some salad greens with I like probably 4 ounces of salmon on it.
Yep.
Kind of like a side thing.
Oh, that was a meal.
Well, I mean the
4 ounces of salmon. Yeah.
So when I looked at that, because I put everything in a chronometer, I try and measure everything very, very specifically and weigh it and all that. And I found out that I had 177.5 grams of protein that day. Now, normally 60 to 80 grams is about my maintenance level per day. So well over double that I got that day. So the interesting thing is the following morning, I'm only at 0.2 ketones. So nowhere close to being, in ketosis, quote unquote. And my blood glucose was 123.
Yeah, I know,
now,
that's interesting.
Also on that day that I had all that protein, I only took in 5 grams of carbs.
Yes, right, good point.
Right?
Yeah,
It wasn't
so
that I
not
had like some excess carbs in there.
Yeah.
This was all seemed to be related to the protein.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, really backed up what we are saying.
So we talked about this study. So we think that excess protein intake that I had certainly elevated my insulin and took me out of ketosis.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, there seemed to be a pretty significant amount of gluconeogenesis because 12 hours after that meal, my blood glucose was raised, which is going to raise insulin as well. But my blood glucose being at 123 is, that's like 40 points higher than my baseline that I typically have. And I've been able to on that protocol, go right back to that. I mean, this week, I've been able to do that. But, here is the bottom line. If you're on a ketogenic diet, you have got to watch your protein intake.
Yeah.
Keep it at the maintenance level. Don't overdo it because it could be very detrimental to your weight loss.
Yeah, that is a great ending to it. And, there's a lot that goes into getting that diet pattern down correctly. We have a lot of free resources. We'll point you to some here in the video. But hey, thanks so much for watching. And please subscribe before you go and hit the bell icon so you see our next video. And till then, have a great week.
We'll see you.